I believe our youth program is about building good humans because you're going to be a human a lot longer than you're going to be a baseball player, whether you
Yeah,
like it or not.
yeah.
Uh,
All right, welcome back to Unleashing the Baseball Mindset. And today we've got another guest. I'm very excited to talk to this guest. I say that every time, but I am always excited as a fellow mental performance professional here. We have Cameron, better known as Coach Cam, with us today. So, how about you give us a little bit of a background? You know, your what you've done in the sport, things that you're doing with mental performance, and all of that type of fun stuff.
sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Coach Cam, owner over at Cover All Bases. And I played professionally for 10 years. Across that 10-year journey, realized it was the mental side of the game that was keeping me from getting where I wanted to go, making it to the big leagues. About 5 years into my career, became a certified mental coach. Learned a lot, helped teach me some things that helped me be better as a player, and now taking that into our youth program.
Excellent. You recognized early was mental, but what really jumped out at you as to kind of like really establish that, hey, I need to focus on the mental game, if there was a particular thing that jumped out.
Yeah, I don't think anything stood out as far as like I was struggling or, wasn't doing well or whatever. I feel like I was always a student of the game and I was always trying to learn things, and mental performance wasn't super popular. I wouldn't say like taboo at the time, but it just wasn't. There was maybe one paid professional on MLB staff that, now they all have programs and, you know,
Right.
training coaches and stuff like that. So it just kind of became something that, some coaches were talking about it. And as a player that's trying to take the next step, it's like if I can find a 1% here, 1% there, and, dove into it. And I think we can all appreciate uh, all the classes you take in school and college and stuff like that. Some of the classes you enjoy reading those books, and some of the classes it's like, man, I gotta get through this, right? And the mental stuff was just, man, I could read that all day long. You got a lot of personal experiences and things you can relate it to. So that was kind of how that journey started.
I've been through all the classes, read all the books, or probably not all of them, but a lot of them. But one of the things that I always think is interesting is whenever I have conversations with high level performers and ones that have whatever they're doing, they've been doing it for a while and they do it well. They sort of inherently know all the things. They can't always describe it. They don't really know, the science behind it or anything like that. But you see that, they've learned over the years that these are the things they need to do for mental toughness or to try to stay, in the game mentally. And I always think that's a fun combination is finding the person that has that practical experience because I mean I do a little bit as a competitor but never at a super high level, and then being able to tie that science into it and really get this very clear picture of how it all fits together. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's, you're reading it and you're like, man, you're telling me about my life. You're telling me about my struggles and all that stuff. And ultimately, I think most people that coach just want to help equip the youth of today with a better toolkit than they had, and maybe they can take one more step than they did. Or at the end of the day, I believe our youth program is about building good humans because you're going to be a human a lot longer than you're going to be a baseball player, whether you
Yeah.
like it or not. So that's the goal.
yeah. Did you notice as you started to learn more about the mental performance coaching and the mental side, did it help boost your confidence? So now thinking, as a mental performance coach, do you feel much more confident than you did as you were playing at that higher level?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it was, again, just the education, the preparation, understanding, where confidence can come from, how you can create it yourself, and how you can reinforce the stuff that helps you feel confident. I think, different different players have different things that help them feel confident, but understanding these are common pieces that go into building confidence and creating confidence, you can then create it yourself once you understand how it works.
So when you guys are running your youth program, how are you implementing the mental performance strategy? Because me and Kyle have been working with my boys for what about a year now? About a year. And what I've seen, and I'm sure you're seeing the same thing. I think everybody's seeing is that these kids aren't really learning how to be mentally tough outside of sport. I mean, really, that's the only way now for them. And we've talked about it plenty of times on the podcast. Is like in school, they make a bad grade, they can retake it, right? they don't really have many chances to fail and get back up. So it's like they just fail and they just redo or whatever. They're not outside, getting in fights, playing backyard baseball, football, basketball, whatever. So have you had struggles with teaching the youth the mental side of the game, and where are you seeing it come to fruition? Like, is it taking 6 months? Is it taking a year? Is it taking 2 years? That's really what I'm wondering, because me and Kyle have seen a lot of progress in my boys on my team, but it hasn't been to, of course, we always want better, right? So it hasn't been to the level that I want it to be yet. Now, it has only been about, what, Kyle, 8 months that we've been working with them specifically.
Yeah, sometime over the summer, but I can't remember the exact date.
Last summer.
Yeah, last summer.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there, a couple
Yeah.
different things to talk about for sure. I think as far as weaving it into our program, I like to take the philosophy of any kid we've had or we have, they don't know anything at all. So anything that I want them to do, we have to make sure we teach it first. So, and then if after we teach it, we do need to practice it. So, just as simple as the first thing we do before we even touch a baseball, before we even stretch, right? Everyone's pretty familiar with what stretch lines look like. And then I don't know about other programs listening or you guys, but like when you do your arm series, we walk it out. So like the whole team looks like a grid, right? I like it to look clean, things like that. So we start out like that, walked out, and then we have our players close their eyes and breathe for 2 minutes. So you hear coaches all the time say, "Hey, relax, take a deep
Breathe.
breath." Well, have you taught them how to properly take a deep breath? Have you taught them that the exhale is the relaxing part of the breath, right? So big inhale, isn't going to help you out, but, focusing on taking long, deep breaths. And then as their eyes closed, I can kind of walk in and out of the grid and talk about setting intentions. The mindfulness practice in and of itself is something where you're paying attention to simple aspects and, not judging them, but just being aware of your five senses. So, walking in and out, I'll talk about the weather, I'll talk about how it feels. I'll talk about what do you want to get better at today. Our slogan last year was give me your best. So whether you're not feeling great, sleepy, tired, whatever. If you got 72%, I want 72%. So we talk about those things and just having those conversations. And then I think from a coaching standpoint, it's really important to be consistent in your messaging. So post-game talks, pre-game talks, practice talks, one-on-one talks, all that stuff. You can't say you're about mindset and mindfulness and things like that. And, when your team's down 1-0, all of a sudden, that goes out the window and you change your tone and things like that.
You're
So I
not
think that's
modeling the
super important.
behavior.
Yeah. And then talk about seeing the payoffs, right? So we all want to, see the fruits of our labor and that stuff happening. I think you got to consider, when you're teaching any skill in the game, throwing, fielding, hitting, you shouldn't have the same expectations of a 10-year-old on the execution level as you do an 18, 24 professional level player, right? You can teach both of them the exact same thing, but that 10-year-old from shortstop's not going to hit the first baseman in the chest as frequently as a high school senior, right? And so I think it's really important as coaches to have more patience for the level of execution. You can teach them to take a deep breath. You can teach them how to do these things better. Doesn't mean they're going to do it.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, as long as they are trying to do the things you're asking them to do, I think it's really important to praise that with the group. But I do see it in our games, and it makes me feel good as a coach. It's probably the coolest thing in the world
Yeah.
when our team has a comeback win, because, I get to see my team be behind. I get to see my boys struggle, make outs, things like that. And, the conversations with the other coaches and stuff like that, everything's fine when the other team's winning. And then
Right.
all of a sudden you get a walk, a bloop, base hit, whatever. And I can feel the other team start to tense up. And as soon as I feel that, I'm like, we got this, right? Like
Yeah.
I've seen my team score 11 runs in the bottom of the whatever with no time left. And I knew it was going to happen on our second run. the other team's still up by a million and they start to tense up because someone made a mistake or whatever. And, not that it's not perfect. Otherwise we would just win every single game. Right. But that's, the payoff that you see, I think, if you're looking for it.
Hmm.
There's
Yeah.
so much good stuff you said in that. The going back a little bit, I really want to highlight that confidence is a skill. And a lot of times people don't know that. They don't want to believe that. They see other kids, other players or whatever, and they think, man, like I just wished I could be as confident as that person. Well, you can be, but it's a trained skill just like everything else. I do think that the mental game is harder than the physical game because we're wired to think negatively. So it's so easy to start getting down on ourselves. And then that's the part that you have to kind of retrain, whether, through mindfulness or whatever the case may be. So I like that you pointed that out. And the other thing, and this is something Dylan and I try to do, like with my company, I call it skill seek, because I think it is absolutely mandatory that you combine the mental skills with the physical skills. We can have I can do a telehealth call or whatever with the player and talk all about confidence and have them do these surveys, and that's all great. But if they're not able to make those connections on the field, it doesn't really matter. So I like that. And I think something I've tried to do, and I'm curious about this. My son is much younger. I think he's a good athlete, but he's playing with 6 and 7 year olds. And I think at that age, like, man, it's hard to teach them diaphragmatic breathing. If I can just get them to take a breath, even if it's while they're at the plate, every time they're at the plate, then later it's going to be easier to say, all right, this is how we're going to do this breath. Maybe you're thinking this or focusing on that. So it's kind of like layering in these skills, knowing they're going to totally butcher it right now. But if the message stays consistent, they'll eventually be able to build all those skills together. Anyway, I think my question in that is, do you think that works? Young player, I'm just going to say breathe. I don't care how you do it right now. Just understand that it's important.
Yeah, every skill has a starting point and a practice, and so again, it doesn't matter how well they execute it. I relate a lot of these things to like bunting in the game. Like we bunt in
Mm.
practice. I Unless a player is struggling and I feel like he needs to feel the ball hit the bat because it hasn't in a while,
Yep.
even, especially the younger levels, if it's your 100%, this is where you should bunt as a team to win the game. We're usually not doing that because I think hitting is a hard skill and I'd rather you keep working on hitting. However, we practice bunting because I know when you turn into a freshman, you're going to have to bunt 6 bunts down the line during tryouts. And that's another goal of our program is you make your high school team. That's a huge step, right? So kind of going back to the breathing thing easy to talk about is, yeah, absolutely. Like we don't want their first JV game to be the first time a coach says, hey man, just, relax, take a deep breath. Right. And then they don't do it very well, or they don't know how to do it. Or as we talk about with like long at bats, you do it for the two pitches that are balls outside and you don't do it on your pitch. And that's when you're a little bit tense and then you foul, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So yeah, absolutely. Just, stacking that time, stacking those reps, all that stuff. And let's get the newbie reps out of the way too. So that you start to see the results faster.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's funny that you brought that up because, like, we still see, like, with the 11 and the 12-year-olds, it's like, you teach them this diaphragmatic breathing, and you still, like, you talk to them during a game, just take a deep breath, and it's, shoulders rise, the shoulders shrug, and it's like you got to go through it so many times with them to really, really get it. And I mean, I've been going through that stuff with Max at least, Brock's a little younger, but with Max for years now. And you'll still see him on the mound and that's how he'll go to breathing. And sometimes I'll even call timeout and go visit with him and say, look, you got to remember how to breathe, right? You know how to breathe for this, how to relax your body, how to slow your heart rate down. You got to do it the right way. We still see it so much, but yeah, it's just that it's got to become subconscious to where they can do that, on cue and they're not even thinking about it.
And I think on that too, Dylan, I don't know if we've talked about this much, or Cameron, if you do it some way. You mentioned, part of the warm up, but even with adults, like when we first start teaching breathing, we get them to lay on their back, because laying on their back, they can relax some of these secondary respiratory muscles a little bit easier. A hand on the stomach, which gives them a kinesthetic cue, but starting to put that into the warm up to where, maybe the first
Yeah.
part practice every day is 5 minutes of breathing, maybe not 5 minutes, but 5 minutes of breathing, integrating in some mindfulness, right? You can do the whole tension release type of thing too as you're working on your breathing. But it starts there, teaching it, and then as they're up and playing, there's still going to be some crappy breaths, but it'll be able to teach that skill as you go.
Yeah, we do that before games, but yeah, like Cameron said earlier with the mindfulness and taking 2 minutes to breathe before practice, I'm gonna implement that. That's a great idea. We always do it before games, but I wanna start doing that in practice.
Cameron, what's a starting point for you with on the mental side? Let's say you have a high level player. He has all the mechanics. You even know that he has the mental side down, but maybe he's just having a bad day, or it's been a bad week, or it's a bad game. Is there a part that's kind of like a reset that you use to get players, back on track with attention and focus?
Yeah, when you talk about like resets and things like that, it automatically makes me think about their routines. So I think anytime you're starting with a player that you either don't know really well or you haven't met, or they're a younger player, it's just asking them to begin with, like, do you have a routine? Do you have a approach at the plate? Right. I think that's an easy one to talk about. We'll ask a kid what their approach is, or a player what their approach is, and, you know, hit hit the ball over the plate, right? And my what I try to guide them towards is, if you have a solid routine, if you have a solid approach and a good plan of action, I shouldn't have any follow-up questions. So that's kind of my barometer for, you have a good routine or you have a good approach. Hitting a fastball over the plate, I've got questions, right? Where does that fastball go? Is it a line drive? Are you hitting a homer? Is it a single? All of those things. And then I've, try to give them what's worked for me. My general approach for 95% of my at bats was, I'm looking to hit a belt high fastball in the outer third of the plate, and I'm going to hit it off the right center field wall. So then that way, it's like, that's pretty clear from a visualization perspective, and, helping our brain ease into that stuff. That's what I look to kind of gauge what a player needs,
Mhm.
what's missing, what gaps can we fill, what education can we provide, and then you gotta practice it from there.
Does that create any kind of limitations though? Like if you're visualizing a specific pitch, what if you never get that pitch? Does it kind of pigeonhole you into not recognizing something else that's hittable? I don't know if that's a very good question, but
Yeah, no, I think, at least my belief is that we want to focus on the positive outcomes that we want to have happen. At the end of the day, all of these kids and adults and professionals are athletes too, so there's adjustability as an athletic player. And my approach right there is, when I'm in hitting mode, I'm either ahead in the count or I don't have two strikes, and then you got a two strike approach that's going to change on that. And a lot of that at the higher levels, it's going to depend on who's throwing, the scouting reports and stuff like that. But our kids don't have that, right? And so, focusing on, I'm pretty confident they're going to get a fastball to hit at some point, if not four. So, getting them to focus on those pieces. And then if they start to struggle with a really good approach, now we can kind of talk about, well, dude, you're hitting three hole, you hit a homer your first at bat of the tournament. So yeah, everybody else is going to throw you off speed the rest of the day. That's just what's going on. So yeah, I guess I think it's better to have a very specific plan and approach and visualization to what you're doing. And then you're going to have to adjust. That's just part of hitting and part of baseball.
Hey, let me back up just a little bit. I had a question earlier I wanted to ask you, Cam. What do you see as a time frame? So, like, let's say you're taking a 9, 10, 11-year-old. I know that it's going to be different for every age group, right? But like, let's say it's a 10-year-old, 11-year-old coming in, great talent, but very raw on the mental side, right? What have you seen on the time frame of mastering the mental approach? Like, obviously not mastering, but becoming really
Yeah.
good at it, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of reflection and self-evaluation there, game to game to game. as we work through it. The basic equation we give all of our players is P equals A minus I. So your performance is your ability minus interferences, right? And so all players want to have more success. They want a better performance standard from a training perspective, practices, lessons, classes, nutrition, sleep, all of that stuff. That should slowly make the A. It should creep up just every week that you're alive, especially as a youth kid. Like you can play Fortnite for 12 hours and guess what? You're going to get stronger because you're just growing so fast, right? Your velo is going to go up whether you throw baseballs or not, but that ability is going to constantly creep up over time. The interferences is the frustrating part for players, for parents, because the interferences do this, right?
Yeah,
They're up, they're
yeah,
down, they
yeah,
change with confidence, with preparation, and all of that. So, you think about a clutch player, they're not going into the World Series and hitting 800. They're just continuing to produce at the level they produced in the regular season because they're good at controlling those interferences. So with a player, some players naturally have a lot more interferences than others for, multiple reasons. We're human beings, home life, environments, stuff like that, how their brain's wired. Do they have, you know, mental things going on from a medical standpoint too?
yeah.
And so then it's from a youth perspective, we do want those big wins early. So as a coach, I'm trying to identify like what is this kid's biggest interference that we can try to eliminate, right? And giving him the tools to eliminate those interferences so that that performance can start to creep up.
So to make sure I have this right, ability, if you're practicing and you're just growing, you're becoming stronger, you're becoming more coordinated, you're becoming whatever, ability is going to tend to naturally increase. So more of the focus is on the interferences, learning to, we can't necessarily control the interferences, but learning how to mitigate and manage some of their effects, whether it's mindfulness or whatever the case may be. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, correct. And I think there was something earlier that, touching on measurements and why mental skills I think is just tougher to either talk about or work on or focus on because you don't have a mental skills exit velo. You don't have a number that says you went from 70 to 72 mindset score. That just you don't have there's no measurables really for that other than the performance output and what you're doing and are you being more consistent and do you feel like you're better at it.
Yeah, we can make one. I'm all about making questionnaires. For some of the stuff that I do, there's like a lot of questionnaires out there, like an anxiety questionnaire, depression questionnaire, and I don't really deal much with those individually from a mental health perspective. So I've built my own questionnaires, and it is the whole point is kind of that, let's get that baseline so we can identify it. We put a number on it. Whether none of the stuff that I've created has been validated in the research, so we couldn't compare it to other kids their age. But for that kid, their score is a 60 or whatever, and then you're already integrating in the mental skills training, so then every season they can redo this questionnaire and let's just see. The idea would be like, hey, we are able to measure some increases in your mental performance through these questionnaires. Not saying they're perfect, but I think it is. We've talked about this a little bit with technology as well. Technology can be good or bad, but one thing it does is it gives us a number to work with now, and we can measure an increase or decrease, and we can do the same thing with somebody's mental performance.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I better to measure that than not measure anything at all, right? I just think about, kids that tend to be harder on themselves
Hmm.
tend to have more success as athletes, right? And so then, what kind of day are they having when they answer that questionnaire?
Right.
When and also, when do you capture that stuff? Do you capture it the second that game ended? And is it going to be different based on 4 for 4, 0 for 4? Um, so there's still a lot of questions there, I think, but that would be the end all be all is being able to measure that and prove that you are more resilient today than you were 6 months ago because we
Yeah.
did
Yeah.
these practices.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, you're absolutely right about that stuff. But the best way to control that is really just through standardization. The kid takes some preseason before they've started practice, before they've done whatever. You're right; they might have had a terrible day, and that affects the results. But if you They wouldn't do it after a game, right? Because it's gonna definitely be different depending on the outcome of that game, but you find a way to give it out there, and just like any surveys that have errors based on any number of things, but again, could just give you a starting point, and then you would see increase, decrease, or maybe no change at all. From a coaching perspective, and I don't do any coaching. My coaching career, I don't do any coaching like of the sport of baseball. That was very short lived. Have you ever noticed things that you say and how you say them and how it affects someone's confidence? And I think that's a very general question. Kind of where I think of this is you already mentioned like let's praise more effort over outcome. But if you need to point out something that didn't go the way it should, something that's negative, how would you word that so it doesn't impact the kid's confidence?
Yeah, great question. I think number one, to try to point out the age of the player super matters here a lot, right? Young kids, as much as I think guys that have baseball experience can appreciate locker room talk, razzing each other, giving each other a hard time. A lot of kids don't understand sarcasm yet. They don't actually understand that you are trying to coach them up in a fun, lighthearted way. They take what you say word for word. And I've made this mistake, obviously, coaching players and doing those things and seeing their facial expression change. And I'm like, oh shoot, that was not the reaction I wanted there. Right. And, which helps me talk about this piece too is number one, the kids, if we're talking about youth, have to understand that you care about them and you love them and you're there to help them get better. And then the just basic coaching philosophy of praise in public, criticize in private. Make sure that that player understands, hey, I want to talk to you about something that happened, your decision making, what were you thinking here, what was going on. But I want to tell you what I want to tell you because I want you to be better and I think you want to be better. And this is coming from a place of love first and foremost. So that's how I want to try to deliver feedback. I think that's a coaching skill is picking up on how to communicate to players, but your words are heavier with a youth player than they are with an older, more experienced player that, for one, he's been coached by different people too. So that helps if they've been kind of beat up on with different coaches. And hopefully they've had other people tell them that, hey, look, he didn't mean that you suck. What he means is he wants you to do a better job and do the things you do in practice and whatever. So they have like a capacity to see that. But I think that's when it's, not you're confidence focused. You don't want the confidence to go down when you criticize. I think that's, good awareness as a coach to even think about that. So then that's where going back to like having a good plan, having a good philosophy is typically going to be the cap on that criticism. Obviously you can do the sandwich, the praise, criticize, praise stuff does work. That's why everyone knows what that means. But I always think it's super important to talk about, this is what it's going to look like the next time you do this and you do it well.
Yeah.
Because you're going to get your arm up or you're going to use your feet, you're going to follow your throw, you're going to, stay on the fastball, you're going to be on time, et cetera, giving them the thing that you want them to do so they can get focused on that piece at the end of the conversation.
Yeah. I think of when you're talking about that, I think of like the inappropriate use of humor, which is something I try to do way too much. And we've seen there's videos on it, right? But you see the coach go up to home plate and he says something like, man, my grandma can throw better than that. And like
Not helpful. Funny, not
it's
helpful.
funny. But then the kid, to your point, the kid might not, he might think like, man, I must really suck. Or your grandma's really good. Like humor is great to break the ice, but you're right to where it depends. A lot of kids they don't really pick up on that. They're reading body language, mixing in what you're trying to say with your words. And a lot of times that doesn't land quite the way we expect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. I've made those mistakes. Cam, what would you say? I don't want to go too far back and say the olden days or the good old days or whatever, because we've done that way too much in the beginning. But what would you say the difference is in coaching, teenagers now versus maybe in the 80s, 90s?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think obviously a big piece of it is the technology that's come out. We just got the full swing monitor for our facility. That's awesome. It's basically just portable hit tracks. Or same thing as if people are familiar with TrackMan. at a lot lower price point. I think that's the biggest thing is today coaches value those measurables a ton. And so naturally people want to do the things coach wants them to do. And we know the schools in our area that are going to pull out the pocket radar for tryouts and things like that. And we know the schools that use the pocket radar for exit velo during the game versus the guys that just set up a tee and man, if you just hit the ball as hard as you can, you're going to go up that list. So that kind of impacts how we train that player naturally, right? We want the kid to make the team. Might not be a good hitter, might not have great baseball IQ, but we're fitting into those metrics on the short term. So I think that's the biggest change is in decades ago, you were just coaching based off of your coach's baseball IQ and what they knew how the game should be played based on their tons of years of experience. And they were right, but they couldn't quantify maybe what is good or how to get better. And I think now we do have a little bit better understanding of what's good, what a good player does. I think one of the biggest disconnects in the youth world is that those don't mean success as a baseball player. I think it's great to train those things. I think it's great to, show kids improvement and stuff like that. But ultimately, I think you touched on it earlier in the conversation of, kids don't have as many opportunities to build resiliency and mental toughness outside of their sports. And so they might be on their birthday might land on the front end of the birthday cutoffs. So at 10 years old, that means you're 10% bigger than the kids you're playing against, which is a massive advantage. And so if all we're doing is looking at those metrics and saying, well, this kid's good, this kid's good, this kid's good, and it's not on anything other than those measurables, that's going to create a huge problem for that player when they're 18 and now they're, 4% larger or 4% more grown than their buddies. And they're all catching up to them because they have better work ethic, better mental resolve, and better awareness of their emotions. And that's what's going
Yeah.
to help them be better.
Yeah. Do you see a lack of, do you think that the confidence level of kids these days is a lot lower than it used to be? You feel that way?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that a lot more negative player emotions get captured because of the phones and because of the videos and things like
Yeah.
that. And
Yep.
so, like we talked about earlier, we're going to focus on the negative more so than the positive. That's how we're wired. And so when we capture a video of a kid crashing out or having a bad day or throwing his bat at 10 to 12, I don't want to say it's normal, but it does happen.
It happens. Yeah.
And as long as it's coached correctly, it's not going to happen again, or
Yeah.
it's gonna keep to decrease over time. So I really just think that it's on public display more so than it ever has been before. And in the good old days, the things that you learn from, the things that are educational, they're embarrassing for a short amount of time until everyone just forgets about it. The
Yeah.
video doesn't exist in the
Right.
cloud
Right.
to go back and say, hey, remember when you were dumb, right? Like
Yeah.
you don't have to
Yeah.
remember it as much.
For sure. For sure.
On those negative emotions, how do you coach if a kid is having a bad day, or let's say they're in a slump, even though I don't really like that term? How do you best navigate that? Like, is there something, let's say it's in a game, are there things you say? And I guess where my mind goes is whenever you're talking about the pitch, right? And I was thinking about this, the pitch being, the outside third of the plate, the whole idea of delusional optimism to where, let's say you do have this one specific pitch that you're gonna, knock out of the park. And delusional optimism would be something like, hey, you didn't throw it that this time, but next time you throw that pitch, like it's going to be a home run. It's out of here. So that's going to give them motivation, even though they might have struck out the last three times. As a coach, what are things that you might try to get them to focus on, or things you tell them to where they do mentally stay in the game? Teaching the players to not tie their self-worth into the result.
Yeah, that's more of I think, a consistent messaging thing. I don't think it's beneficial to deliver many new messages in the heat of the battle. I think it's important to talk about in a practice setting, in a controlled setting, one-on-one time with players. My favorite time to talk to our kids is during catch play. I think it's the most undercoached time in all of youth baseball. If you want to point out, watch a group that isn't invested in their kids and cares about their kids, watch them play catch. You see two coaches in the dugout, that's a problem, right? While they're playing catch, they are focused on something. I'm walking, weaving the lines and just talking about their day and stuff like that. Then that's where you can also talk about, you know, your results as a player doesn't mean you're a bad human, a good human. You are not a baseball player. You are, Cameron Monger. And you have all these other good skills about you. And we're going to focus on for this season for you. Do you hustle on and off the field? Do you pick up your teammates? Are you a good friend? Are you a good son? And that's the stuff that you got to have those conversations in a neutral environment, a low stress environment. So then when the crash out happens, when the negative things happen, when the over 3 thing happens and they're frustrated, there's an anchoring point to, man, I know you're struggling today. I've been there. I know it sucks. And I know you're mad. Just, remember that, you hustled down the line all 3 times. That's what we're looking for. And there's an anchor to that. And I'm not just saying that because I want to win this game and I need him to lock in on the next at bat. There's a point of reference for the player so that they can believe you.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that.
I think as coaches too, man, like that's such an important point for coaches. I think too many of coaches, their self-worth is tied into win or loss records or success of, their team or whatever at such a young age too, man. Like, we see it in 9U, I think is where all the craziness starts happening, right? Is that 9U, 10U, 11U, 12U. And as coaches, and I mean, I've made the mistake, right? Is getting so upset about a specific tournament to where, it ruins me for a few days, and I think that's such a good message to always go back to as coaches too, is to realize that that's not who we are. We're trying to, like you said earlier, we're trying to build men. Or young men, we're trying to build good humans. And it's not about win or loss. It's not about, individual success as far as, whether it's a player on the team or yourself. And I think that's a missed concept, is that so many coaches, like, their self-value is in their club baseball team, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and the problem with that is just not defining success for yourself, right? As a coach, if that kind of resonates with any coaches out there, defining success for our players, you know, trying to swing at good pitches, always hustle down the line, things that you have 100% control of, and then, talking about that stuff pregame, postgame. As a coach, it's not the worst thing in the world. And I try to remind myself of this as frequently as I can, that, my goal is to look for opportunities to provide life lessons to these kids, to encourage positive behavior on stuff, whether it's on or off the field. And then you remind yourself of that, you keep that stuff front of mind. Then when the game's over, the scoreboard is whatever it is, and it helps me sleep at night for sure, knowing that, what, we lost, but, I allowed so and so to battle for himself, to pick himself up off the ground, and hope he's going to be better prepared the next time that situation hits him.
I'm a big fan of goal setting. And to me, and Dylan and I have talked about this, but I feel like across the board, whether it's youth athletes or an adult business person, if we take the time to truly set meaningful goals, and this is working through, all of the, they have like the SMART goal setting framework, which I think is great. But to me, goal setting is, you get really deep. It's beyond any type of superficial motivation that you can imagine. And what I often find too is that leads to focusing or recognizing something bigger. And so for myself, as a Christian, that something bigger to me is trying to be more like Jesus, and not trying to force that on anybody. But it is a thing of, there's something much bigger happening here that kids of all players need to recognize. And that should always be the focus. Win, loss, terrible game, great game, it should always be like, well, that's great. I played well. I'm excited. Or maybe I didn't play well. That's okay, because this is the goal. This is what I'm working on. Baseball is simply the medium, or perhaps the vessel, to lead me to these things. And you mentioned like having that anchor. And I think that's such an important word is have yourself an anchor that goes beyond superficial motivation, that goes beyond whatever the case may be, because that is always consistent. It's always going to be the thing of, we're always daily moving closer to whatever that thing may be. And the failures, they help with that, right? It's going to make me be a stronger player to be able to do this later in life. I don't really think I had a question that goes along with that, but more so just kind of recognizing that the goal setting, which you mentioned defining success for coaches, and then that anchoring. I think it's really important. Find something meaningful to anchor in that is consistent throughout the lifespan.
Yeah, I guess kind of my take on goals and stuff, and we talk about this with our younger coaches a lot. The Seneca quote, I always butcher it because they talked different back then, but a guy that doesn't know what port he's going to, no wind is favorable, right? So at the end of the day, you got to at least have a goal. And you want to talk about kids coming out of baseball, they're done playing baseball, still like baseball. They think they want to coach. They maybe want to coach. They do want to make money. And at the end of the day, like having that goal, that specific goal in front of you, my message to them is always like, just this might not be your lifelong goal, but it's your goal right now. And the harder you work at it, the more skills you're going to develop and the better understanding you have of, do I want to actually do this thing? Right. Everyone wants to be focused on kids quitting sports or kids not, you know, falling through past 13 and things like that. I think the number 72% or whatever it came out in that report is super high and discouraging. But at the end of the day, not everyone's a baseball player. And I think that, part of my job as a coach is to give good, honest feedback. If they say they want to play in the big leagues and I can communicate to that player, you're not doing the things that are going to get you to the big leagues. You don't have to train 7 days a week at 10, but you do have to take pride in your reps and you do have to hustle on and off the field. And we do have to establish some certain things, and if you can help some awareness be built around that, you know, the faster you can get on the path of what your life's mission is going to be. Right. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on goals and stuff like that. Is it does help. It helps guide the conversation. You said you wanted this,
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
we either got to talk about, do we actually want it, or are we going to realize, hey, coach is right. I do need to do this better. I do need to do that better because I do want it.
Yeah, and I think that's it's almost the most impactful part about goal setting is working through the potential hurdles. And with that player, like this is what you want to do. This is what that looks like. And you can commit to this or not. And you can always change the goal. Goals change. They're never written in stone. That's why I think, something, for me, something spiritual is kind of like the ultimate goal, and these other things can help with that. But it is like, hey, you want to do this, you got to hustle, you got to practice, you got to do this. And you can say now, maybe it's not really what you want. And that's okay. It's not for everybody, just like you said. So yeah, I think, for me, more so than having that clear specific goal, it's the process of goal setting to identify hurdles and problems and just barriers.
Cam, what's your thoughts on Kyle? You're gonna like this one. What's your thoughts on practice, the grind, the grit that it takes to play at a higher level? Would you say that you really enjoyed the grind and the grit and the practice, or did you enjoy the games, the tournaments, or whatever, however you want to phrase that part? I've had this argument a lot with a few people for some reason at a very young age. And my dad says it wasn't necessarily one of those things that I just happened to love right away. Over time, I did. But I can say from a very young age, I loved the process more than I loved the games. Now, obviously, I loved playing a game. I loved hitting home runs, whatever it was. I loved doing that, but I loved the process. And I
Yeah.
really I've embraced it and I enjoyed every minute of it. From what I can remember back to, my dad said it took a while to get there. Maybe it did, but all I can remember is loving it. Even from 5 years old, I remember going outside and taking, however many ground balls. And then it ended up being where my dad would wake me up at 5 in the morning. We'd go take 500 ground balls. We'd take some hacks and I'd pitch a little bit because I did pitch a little bit, but I loved it. I loved every minute of it. What would you
Sorry, we
say?
got the dogs. They've been so good. I actually just told my wife that Usually we get like 2 or 3 out, open, close the door moments here, but mailman must have swung by. So, this is a whole hour conversation in itself, right? The chicken or the egg, the motivation or the confidence, right? And this goes also into the large number of kids that quit at 13. Kyle, you might have seen the research and know it better offhand. It's just been so long since I've looked at it. But there's a window of time from like 11 to 14 or 12 to 15 or whatever in young boys' mental development where their wick for am I good at this thing is the shortest. So that's huge, right? Is you can have a kid that has been a phenom for a long, long time and the field gets a little bit bigger and they have 4 weeks of struggles and say, I want to quit. I think it's important for parents to understand, and while you want your kid to do what they want to do and it be their path and things like that, you're also an adult. You're an adult. You know what the next 50 years of life looks like. And it is okay to go through a little bit of struggle short term, as long as the goal, going back to the other stuff we talked about, is correct. Like we are trying to accomplish certain things as a human and build some resiliency and do those things. And then if we get to, 15, 16, it's like, I really don't like this sport because of these reasons, not just because I have a short term struggle right now. I think that's something that parents got to pay attention to and got to educate themselves on and make the best decision for their kid. Anecdotal story on that. One of the first kids I ever gave lessons to, also the first kid I ever hired at Cover All Bases, Brogan. He was going to a high school where he wasn't playing for the preferred select team, which, you talk about back in the day, that was definitely a
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Now there's so many select teams that I think high school coaches can't fight that anymore because there are too many good players coming from different programs. But you want to talk about a 5'10" switch hitting, pretty good catch and throw catcher that gets cut his freshman year? Shouldn't happen. Yeah, I don't care how good your program is, and the dad regrets because he went to multiple booster club meetings and got approached by multiple people in the favorite program that said, hey, really think, we get a better look at our players when they're over here and this and that. And David, goes to Brogan, the 14-year-old child, and says, hey, Brogan, what do you want? You want to play on this team or you want to play on this team? Well, what's the 14-year-old kid going to say? I want to play with my friends. This is what I want to do. Wow, that's a really tough decision to make. It had a pretty big impact because David, the adult, understands politics and, the local community and stuff like that. Brogan doesn't know that. Brogan just wants to play and have fun and things like that. And I hate that story. But that, kind of ties into what we're talking about, that, you sometimes you have to push through a little bit of that adversity, and it's tough to watch your kids struggle. That's a big part of what we talk about. I'm going to let your kid strike out and fall down and make mistakes and stuff like that and talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, highlighting, the struggle like that, and this is the hardest part of it all, I think, but that's where it all happens, the whole thing of the example I've used on here before, and you might know it too, but like lifting weights, it's easy to know whenever your muscles are doing work because they start to burn and it hurts and all that. Learning a new skill, the only thing we can feel is frustration. And then it's hard again to get kids to understand that. But if you reframe that, like, man, you're in a slump, you're struggling. That's great. That's the best thing that could happen for you right now because it means you're learning and then getting them to stick with it. And kind of what I took from that too, Dylan had asked about the practice. I took from what you said as a parent, sometimes I'm going to have to make my kid go practice, whether he likes it or not. And that's just kind of the deal. Get out there. We're going to do this. Doesn't have to be for real long, but every day you're going to spend a few minutes doing this or that. And then you get them through kind of that sticking point that you mentioned and maybe get them to the next level or to the next season or whatever. And then they can look back and think, you know what, I worked through that. You never quit during a season. That should be an absolute no-no for all parents. But after that season, then maybe you think, all right, maybe baseball's not for me and these are the reasons why. But yeah, as a parent, got to push them a little bit. And at the very end, you can't let them quit.
Yeah.
What maybe a couple more quick questions. One that jumps out here that I wanted to ask is if you had to narrow down one mental skill, one mental performance technique for younger players, what do you think that would be? What do you think would be something to be proactive in teaching kids rather than waiting until problems come up later?
Yeah, I'd probably say emotional intelligence or awareness, just understanding what feelings are and what your different emotions are doing and anger and joy and frustration and all that stuff and just being aware of that. We I try to, because I don't expect kids to go home and close their eyes and crisscross and meditate and do breathing practices. So have tried to create or implement mindfulness practices that are a little bit more active. Again, I talked about this earlier, but doing something that's super simple, and being focused on the task at hand and then recognizing your thoughts as you go. So all of these kids go to school, they all walk around. So we challenge our kids to, as they're going from class to class, to, instead of counting their breaths 1 through 10, count their steps 1 through 10. And so paying attention to how your foot makes contact to the ground. You got a lot more distractions at school, and just notice that if at some point for most kids, they're going to stop paying attention to 1 through 10. They're going to see something, see their buddy, or, someone's going to holler something in the hallway or whatever. Um, and then mindful eating, I think, is really important, because one, it kind of keys in on that nutrition is important, but you don't have to be told how to chew and how to do those things. But while you are eating, you can be hyper focused on the textures, the flavors, and all of those things. And that gets you a little bit more awareness. And then, at least for me, it's mindful showers. You don't have to lock into what you're supposed to do at this point on how to wash your body. But the goal of a shower is to clean our body. But that's also, too, where I get a lot of good ideas. Things pop in your head. You're thinking about your homework. You're thinking about your test later, all of that stuff. And if we can get our kids to pay attention to, the water temperature, the smells of the soap, and all of those things, that's going to bring some more awareness around what's going on. And then hopefully when we have competition and battles and emotions, when we talk about, what are you feeling there, they're going to start to have better answers.
Yeah.
That's good.
And I like that too with both the steps and the chewing, because a key thing with attention, focus, and control and using mindfulness to develop that, it's not necessarily being able to focus in on one thing that tends to be the problem or the strength. The strength in mindfulness is being distracted, recognizing that it's a distraction, and then bringing your attention back to what your focus is. So if a kid is eating lunch and they're chewing and they're getting interrupted, that's great, because then they strengthen attention by addressing whatever this kid says or whatever, bringing it back to the chewing. And that appears to be generalizable. If I can improve my attention and focus and control in my chewing, I'll be able to better avoid distractions in the hallway. I'll be able to better avoid distractions on the baseball field. I've never thought about that with the counting the steps and the chewing, but I think that's a great idea.
Well, and that can also negate what's going on the screens, right? You know, like they can negate a lot of what's going on with the screens because we're not gonna be able to stop our players from using the phones or whatever, they're using. But those techniques can negate a lot of what's going on in our brain or their brains when they're using the devices.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. One last thing I have, and the definition of confidence. Do you have a running definition of confidence that you use? And if so, what is it? If you don't mind me asking.
Yeah, don't mind the question. I guess I haven't thought much about the definition of confidence. I want to say it's connected to their belief, but it's not exactly belief. There's a gap there, right? Probably the separation from what I'm trying to accomplish and my belief in it on actually getting it done. Probably easier to speak on like where I think confidence comes from. I think being prepared, I think, is the best way to be confident. The analogy for our kids is if I throw you in a biology class and you never had a biology class before, and then you got to take the final exam, you're not going to be confident in that at all. So, being prepared is number one. And then grading yourself on the stuff that you can control is number two. So if you have the skill set, if you're 10 years old and you're facing Clayton Kershaw, you're not going to feel great about that no matter how many times you hit that week. But on the flip side, facing Clayton Kershaw, like for us, goals for our hitters is to see the ball well and swing at good pitches. Those are things that they can control. You can have a 7-pitch strikeout, take 3 balls, take a tough strike, foul off your pitch, and then swing and miss and say, you know what, I went, 6 for 7 there instead of 0 for 1 with a strikeout.
Yeah.
So I think that's important.
Yeah. So one of the definitions I like to use, and it comes from a sports psychologist named Nate Zinser. And he says that he defines confidence as a sense of certainty about your ability, which allows you to bypass conscious thoughts and execute unconsciously. It would be tough to describe that as a kid, but that really breaks out into 4 key parts. And the sense of certainty is complete faith in your ability, which comes from preparation. So absolutely, like I know I can do this because I've done it before, so I don't question my ability to do it. And then the other 2 parts I'll highlight: bypass conscious thought. We know that as soon as we start thinking about the mechanics or this or that, we're going to mess the whole thing up. So you don't even let it come into your conscious thought. And then that last one with the executing unconsciously, it's back to preparation. You've done it so much that your body knows what to do. And the key is not just the definition of the things, it's trusting it. When you get into the batter's box, if you have true confidence, you trust it. Whatever happens, happens. And that's fine. Just like you said.
Big thing for me in the youth space too is just what you guys are doing is incredible because it's helping getting the word out. I don't want to say this in a negative light, but a reality is a youth team of 12 parents, there is going to be more ignorant information than experienced information coming at them. So, just like how marketing and advertising works, the more times you see stuff, the more likely you're going to fall into the trap, so to speak. So I think anytime we can just actually talk about real verified experiences, things that work, things that don't work, that are real versus, a lot of the stuff that's out there in the youth baseball space isn't necessarily real or genuine. So just appreciate
Yeah.
you guys putting this together and having these conversations and getting them out there, and hopefully people, consume them and question them and want to get better and open-minded.